Well, I am Megan Bachman, and I'm here with Richard Heinberg. Welcome, Richard. Can you share a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Senior Fellow at Post-Carbon Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank headquartered in Santa Rosa, California, where I live. And we do work on energy issues and developing community resilience. I've written a dozen books over the last 15, 20 years, most of them having to do, again, with energy and our energy past, our energy present, and our energy future. Fossil fuels, what an enormous difference they've made in human lives and our economies. What are some of the negative aspects of fossil fuels? The fact that they're causing climate change, the fact that they're non-renewable, depleting resources, and what we're going to do as we shift away from fossil fuels, as we necessarily must. My organization is called the Post-Carbon Institute, and that tells you a lot right there. Our concern really is with what comes after fossil fuels and how we make the transition to a post-fossil fuel society.
You mentioned that you focus on the energy past, energy present, and energy future. Could you share a little bit about each of those pieces? Really, where have we been? Where are we right now from your perspective? And what is your really unique perspective on the future? Because it seems to be a little different compared to what a lot of policymakers and think tanks are prognosticating for the future.
Yes, well, our energy past is pretty simple. Until the last couple of hundred years, we relied mostly on firewood as our primary fuel source. And we used energy to change the world around us to get what we wanted and needed mostly by way of muscle power. So these were renewable sources of energy, but they were limited sources of energy. And we designed the landscape and infrastructure and technology around us to suit those energy sources. Then with fossil fuels, we gained access to energy sources that were far more concentrated, that were easily portable, and that could do all kinds of things that we really couldn't do before. Oil, coal, natural gas. We essentially changed the world, redesigned the world to suit the unique qualities and characteristics of those fuels. We invented cars, planes, trains, cargo ships running on oil. We developed an electricity grid system to support, myriads of gadgets and labor-saving devices. And we saved so much labor that people, by the millions upon millions, moved from the farms where they had been direct primary producers of energy in the form of food, moved to cities where they became users of energy in offices and homes, wherever. So that's our energy present. We've become overwhelmingly dependent on these rapidly depleting fossil fuels that have impacts on the environment that are accumulating and that are ultimately unacceptable. So our energy future is going to be a shift away from this overwhelming dependence on fossil fuels. It's going to happen one way or another, whether we plan for it or not. If we plan the transition, it's going to go much better. If we don't plan, then the result will simply be society will be pummeled repeatedly and to an ever greater degree by climate change. And meanwhile, the increasing difficulty of extracting fossil fuels from the ground will result in economic chaos and disaster. It's not a very happy scenario. So our energy future is a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. I think everybody agrees that that's true. Some people, of course, say it's really urgent and we have to do it in the next 20 years, and other people say, well, yeah, fossil fuels are so good we can't leave them behind yet, and we have plenty of time and we'll do this over the course of the next century or two, no big deal. I'm of the former persuasion. I think it's really urgent, something we have to do right away, starting 20 years ago. But at the same time, I'm also of the view that this is going to be difficult. It's not going to be really easy. It's not just a matter of unplug the coal power plant, plug in the solar panel, and continue with business as usual. The reason is, as I said a minute ago, we designed our energy usage infrastructure around the specific qualities and characteristics of fossil fuels. And we've been doing that for 200 years, and we did a really good job of it. And the energy sources we're going to be replacing fossil fuels with, solar and wind and other renewable sources, have different qualities and characteristics. The sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing. These are more diffuse sources of energy. They're going to require changes in how we use energy. And we'll probably have a lot less energy to use. So that means that energy demand adaptation is actually just as important as the transition in our sources of energy. How we use energy is just as important as where we get it from.
And that's not a very popular opinion to put out there. I know there was the recent editorial in the New York Times that called out your organization as being, I know you've heard this term before, I'm sure, pessimistic about our future, and that being a harm to the environmental movement that's trying to really convince policymakers and the public that renewables are an important thing to invest in. Yeah. So how do you negotiate that tension? Why are you putting out the message that you are?
We're putting out this message because it's true. We want to be realistic. From a political standpoint, it suits a lot of people to say that we can get rid of the fossil fuels and plug in renewables and keep doing everything the way we're doing it now, only better. We'll have lots more jobs and the economy will grow because we're spending all this money on renewables and so on. And there's some truth to that. Certainly if we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on renewable energy sources, that'll create a lot of jobs. And it's important to understand that at the end of the day, this is taking us to a different future from what we've been led to expect on the basis of our fossil fuel past. And if we don't prepare for that future, if we don't start building that future, we're going to end up building a pathway to a future that doesn't exist. And that's what we're doing right now. We're still investing societal resources in infrastructure that has no future. We're still building and widening highways and freeways as though we're still going to be driving cars 50 years from now the same way we are today. Well, guess what? Vehicle miles traveled, the index of how much people are actually driving, has been declining, flat to declining for the past 5 or 6 years. We're not becoming ever more mobile as a society, which is what we're led to expect during the course of the 20th century, that we would just become more and more mobile until we were living on the moon and Mars and other planets and ultimately going off to other stars. Well, it ain't happening because it takes too much energy. The reality is this is our home, and the amount of energy that we're able to use is finite. The amount of sunlight that falls on the planet is enormous, that's true. But in order to use that for our human purposes in electric wall sockets and charging iPhones and so on requires technology to gather that diffuse energy and concentrate it. And that takes energy and materials. There's no free lunch in the energy world. And the sooner we understand that, the sooner we'll be able to start making the hard choices about what we really need to do to support a decent quality of human life on the planet, as opposed to all of the gadgets and gizmos that might make somebody a lot of money but really don't improve life at all. And see, with the consumer economy that we developed during the 20th century, there was no differentiation, no distinction between needs and desires. In fact, with consumerism, the object of the game was to create as many new desires for products as we possibly could. The problem in the early 20th century with lots of cheap fossil fuels, the problem was overproduction. Factories making stuff faster in larger quantities than people could buy them. So we created advertising to make people want more stuff. We created consumer credit so people could go into debt to buy stuff that they couldn't afford. That was the economy of the 20th century. That's not the economy of the 21st century as we move toward renewables. It's going to be a slower, leaner, and more local economy. But it's an economy that's going to get us back in touch with what really counts.
So Richard, you have been known as a peak oil advocate, educator, and since your book came out 2003, I believe it was, The Party's Over. And yet today, the media is talking about what this peak oil thing was totally wrong. We're in the midst of the quote-unquote new U.S. energy revolution. Right. You hear figures still that we're going to have enough for 50, 60, 100 years. That continues. So can you share kind of, first explain what this peak oil concept is, mm-hmm. and whether you think it still is a concept worth explaining to people, and what the real story of the U.S. energy economy is right now.
Right. Well, the peak oil notion is very simple. Oil is a finite resource. There's only so much in the ground. And as with all finite resources, extraction is going to increase until we can't increase it anymore, and then it's going to level off and decline. So the idea of peak oil is that peak in production is something that we can look forward to in a finite period of time. It's not something that's going to happen 500 or 1,000 years from now. It's something that, you know, is meaningful in terms of the lives of people who are around today. When I started writing about peak oil over a decade ago, my mentors were a couple of petroleum geologists named Colin Campbell and Jean Lahirère. And they were saying that world conventional oil production would peak around 2005 to 2010, and that would increase the price of oil, which would incentivize the production of unconventional oils from deep water, heavy oil, tar sands, things like that. And that unconventional oil would then peak somewhat later, maybe around 2015. And that would be the peak of total liquid fuels, and that then after that we would see some pretty substantial economic impacts throughout the economy. Well, that's pretty much what's happened. World conventional oil production has been on a plateau to slightly declining, actually, since about 2005, 2006. And total production, including unconventionals, has still been on an increase, and that has been led by tight oil production here in the U.S. Tight oil is oil that's locked in often shale reservoirs. Conventional oil is usually in more porous, permeable rocks like sandstone and limestone. But this tight oil requires expensive technology to liberate it, hydrofracturing, horizontal drilling. So it's only because prices of oil started marching up as regular conventional oil started flatlining. The price of oil started marching up from 20 bucks a barrel to over $100 a barrel. It even got up to almost $150 a barrel in 2008. So with higher oil prices, that created the incentive for a lot of risk-friendly, smaller oil companies to go after these sources that geologists knew were there, but thought, we'll never get to that stuff. That's like the bottom of the barrel. But okay, that's what we have left, so let's apply some fancy new expensive technology and get it out of the ground. That's what they've been doing, and it's been very successful. The U.S. Has increased its oil production by over 3 million barrels a day as a result of fracking, okay? So a lot of people look at that and they say, well, what's this peak oil about? Obviously we're going to be able to continue doing this forever, which of course is ridiculous. There's a expiry date on fracking, on tight oil, and my organization has looked at that in some detail. We've done the most thorough analytic work on the prospects for tight oil in the U.S. of any organization in the world, including the U.S. Department of Energy. And what we found is that the individual wells deplete very rapidly and decline in production very rapidly. Often, if let's say you drill a well in January, by December, the rate of production from that well will have fallen by 70%. That means that companies have to drill and drill and drill in order to keep production increasing. So they've already drilled thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of wells, and in order to meet the expectations of their investors and of the government, which has made all sorts of big claims about our future oil production from these sources, in order to meet those expectations, hundreds of thousands of wells will have to be drilled over the next 2 or 3 decades. We don't see that as likely, primarily because there are only so many places you can drill. And the best places have already been drilled. There are sweet spots or core areas within each of the plays or the geographical and geological formations where tight oil is present. There are these small core areas where production is actually profitable and prolific. But if you get outside the core areas, initial production rates are lower and decline rates are even steeper. So right now, producers who are operating outside the core areas are already losing money. And currently, oil prices are softening globally. And the reasons for that are complex. It doesn't have really so much to do with the glut of oil as with the weakness of economies, especially industrial economies and developing economies, in their ability to afford oil at the price that it's been for the past 5 years. So with oil prices going down, the profitability of tight oil is just evaporating. So we're going to see U.S. oil production peak and begin to decline again, as it did in 1970. It's going to do the same thing now over the course of the next 2-3 years. In my book, I suggest there are 3 limits to further economic expansion that are converging. One is energy, which we've been talking about. We had a century of unprecedented quantities of energy available at unprecedented low prices, and that drove economic growth as never before in world history. And we weren't even talking about economic growth before that happened. We didn't expect the economy to continually grow. It's only because, with cheap energy, we were able to stimulate it to that extent that we acquired this assumption that it's natural and normal for economies to constantly grow. Okay, so energy is changing, and so it's not going to be possible to grow economies the way we formerly did, simply because there won't be the energy there to make it happen. And we're not going to be able to use energy more efficiently. Yes, we can use energy more efficiently, full stop. And the rate at which we improve energy efficiency is subject to the law of diminishing returns. The first 5% improvement in efficiency is cheaper than the next 5%, which is cheaper than the next 5%, and so on. So yes, we can decouple energy growth from, or we can decouple economic growth from energy consumption to a certain extent, but it's a very limited extent. Okay, so that's factor one. Factor two is limits to debt. One of the things that happened as we developed the consumer economy was we made it easier for people to go into debt in order to consume now and pay later. That was a way of stimulating economic growth. And since roughly 1980, debt has grown at about 2.5 times the pace of GDP. Okay, well, all of that new debt has helped to keep the economy growing, people borrowing more money to buy more stuff and so on. But you can't keep doing that forever. You know, beyond a certain point, people can no longer afford to make the payments on the debt they already have, and banks don't want to loan them more money. And the evidence suggests we pretty much got to that point around 2008. And that's, you know, boiling down a very complex situation into a very simple explanation. We hit the limits to debt. And I'm not talking about government debt, I'm talking about consumer debt primarily. Now, what we did as a result of that was the government did start spending, deficit spending on a much larger scale in order to stimulate the economy. Central banks, not only the US Federal Reserve, but also the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Chinese Central Bank, all started injecting enormous trillions of yuan and pounds and dollars into their respective economies in order to keep those economies from crashing. And as a result, we mostly stabilized the situation. But it's a very perilous kind of stability because we haven't stimulated a genuine recovery back to normal levels of growth. All we've done is put the economy on life support. Okay, and the methods we've used to do that, zero interest rates, quantitative easing, government deficit spending, are methods that can't be deployed forever, and they can't be, you know, deployed again and again and again without their eventually losing force. Again, the subject to the law of diminishing returns. So for that reason as well, I think we're in new economic territory, different from the normal of the 20th century, the late 20th century. And then the third factor is environmental impacts, primarily climate change. If you look at insured losses, what insurance companies are actually having to pay out for extreme weather events and the natural disasters related to extreme weather events, it's on a rising curve. And extrapolate that out a couple of decades, and it pretty much wipes out any economic growth that we would otherwise have. That's not the only kind of environmental impact that we're looking at. We're also seeing, you know, depleting topsoil and acidification of the oceans and disappearing biodiversity. All of these things have costs, not just to nature. It's not all about the polar bears. Ultimately, these things impact the human economy, what we really do care about as well. So these three factors are converging in real time. Limits to cheap energy, limits to debt, and limits to the environment's ability to absorb the insults from our increasing economic activity. And the consequence of these converging factors is that economic growth, as we have known it, is effectively over. Yes, you can argue US GDP has nudged upward over the last few years. China's still growing. But a lot of that growth, both in the US and in China, is paper growth. It's not real sustainable growth. And if growth even is sustainable, I would question that. But it's produced by changing the definition of employment versus unemployment. It's changing the definition of GDP. It's changing the definition of all kinds of things to make it appear as though we're having growth, because that's what everybody wants. You know, labor wants growth so we can have more jobs. Business wants growth because they want returns on investments. And government wants growth so they can have more tax revenues. There's nobody out there who's willing to say, hey, maybe we just can't have more growth and we need to adapt. So as a result, everyone is living in this fantasy world where they think that growth is normal, it's their birthright, we deserve it, by golly, and if we don't have it, it must be somebody's fault. And if we can figure out who that is and vote them out of office or put them in prison, then everything will return to normal. Frankly, I don't think that's true. And by not adapting to reality and by living in this fantasy world, we're actually undermining our future prospects. If you don't deal with reality, reality will deal with you.
So what is the vision of the sustainable economy, and how do we get there?
Well, a sustainable economy is really all about getting back to the real normal. If you look at the long-term norms of human energy consumption, how people have lived over, not just the last 50 years, but hundreds of years, we're talking about much lower levels of energy consumption, lower levels of urban activity, people living much closer to the land, and in a generally more sustainable way. Now, the idea that we would go back somehow to living the way our ancestors lived, nobody, that's unthinkable. And I'm not suggesting that's exactly what we should do or will do, because the future never looks exactly like the past, where everything changes, and no one can forecast the future with any accuracy anyway. Nevertheless, it's clear that we don't have the energy, we won't have the energy in the future to support the kind of lifestyle that we've come to enjoy in modern industrial nations like the United States and Canada and Australia and Europe. So life is going to look different. And it doesn't mean it's going to be some horrible, dreadful future of, drudgery and misery, because that's not what the past was either. In fact, if you look at read the biographies and autobiographies of people in the 18th and 19th centuries, sure, they had challenges. Well, the 20th century had plenty of challenges too. A couple of world wars, a Great Depression. There was lots of misery during all of that time of incredible plenty. But there's always something to enjoy and celebrate in life. But if we concentrate on those innate and genuine experiences of happiness and pleasure that we have, we find they tend to come from within ourselves and from our relationships with the people around us to a much greater degree than from technology and money and all of the gadgets and gizmos and goodies that we associate with economic growth. And that's what we have to do if we're going to have a future that's really something worth looking forward to. It's going to come from those sources. It's going to come about because we're paying attention to what really matters, rather than trying desperately to hold on to, flat screen TVs and all the rest.
So what would you say is the most significant barrier to creating a sustainable society right now?
Well, there are several significant barriers. I mean, obviously you could point to the political system, the fact that we don't have any leaders out there right now who are calling for the kinds of changes in expectations and energy consumption and so on. But the reason we don't have leaders is that they would get no support from their main real constituency, which is industrialists and bankers. So where do you start? I think we have to start with ordinary people. People understand that something is not right, that the world is changing underneath their feet. And nobody is explaining it to them. Their politicians aren't explaining it to them. The commercials on TV aren't explaining it to them. They're all telling them that they should expect more of the same. And if they're not getting it, it's because of this other guy over here that you should blame. And it's accomplishing nothing. So my hope is that not just me, but hundreds of people who are out talking about these issues, who understand sustainability, who understand our energy situation. It's my hope that we can reach ordinary people where they're living and help them adapt in their daily lives. It's got to be a bottom-up transition and transformation of society. I don't think it's going to happen from the top down. And in fact, if you want me to name, one barrier to this transition, I'd say it's the cultural elites, the people who are really in charge of the larger systems of society, the money system, the energy system. They're all stuck on the expectation of more growth, more profits, more returns on investment, and they'll cannibalize the rest of the system. They'll make life miserable for the common person so that they can maintain their little castle on the hill. But ultimately, it's not sustainable for them either. Ultimately, it's in their interest as well that we make this transition. But unfortunately, they can't see it yet.
Well, thank you, Richard.
It's been a pleasure, Megan. Thank you.